Welcome everybody. Today is the day we are going to show the dox42 electronic reporting integration in finance and supply chain in all its power. Very much looking forward to it. Let's dive right in. Okay, what you are going to see first is that we are, in this case, in standard invoicing. So we will just generate an invoice as you're used to. We'll click on the standard procedures, which of course we will see later on, are also possible in other scenarios then, that you, for example, do it in the batch jobs like you're used to, in the print management, etc. And we have a very nice looking email, which I will show you in a second. But of course, we have a very nice looking invoice in this case with data from directly D365 Finance and Supply Chain, with, of course, everything that you're used to within dox42, repetitions, conditions, sub-documents, everything that we have worked with also the data provider documents, we can now do also with electronic reporting. So basically, so far, there is no big difference, right? You get the nice looking document, but there's a lot that is happening in the background, which will make it very much easier to switch from data provider to electronic reporting as a data source for dox42. So let's have a look. What do we need to do? The first thing that I'd like to show you is the configuration of, in this case, the electronic reporting. So let's have a look into the configurations. And what we will see in here is, of course, there are, well, those that you are used to, the standard one, but there is also a sales invoice, which is based on the Excel, on the output of electronic reporting. And we do have a specific one that we are using in this case as the data source for dox42. So basically what's happening here is that instead of using the data provider, we will be able to use the data that we include into an Excel, in this case, finance and supply chain, and that we are then going to use in dox42. And there are a couple of steps that we will need to go through, which of course also, as you're used to in our documentation. And in this case, the first step that we need to do to map this to dox42 is in the next step. There is the dox42 configurations, which very much links to the configurations. You have the dox42 configurations, and with the latest version, you will see them happening here. So there's the dox42 configurations. And what we will see in here also is that we map the model that we have in electronic reporting to a configuration that we will then be able to use within dox42. Okay, so that's that, also in a specific format. And the next step we are going to do in the configurations is that we will have a look in to the dox42 parameters, which is, of course, the location where you usually are working with the SSRS reports. And that's, well, among the most important ones, with the difference of the new version. So you don't have, like, probably you're used to just having the reports here. We now have the SSRS reports, well, which we have been all working with in the past. But very importantly, there is a new option, which is the electronic reporting reports. They are working very much the same, with a little bit of a difference to what you're used to with the SSRS. So you still have you pick the configuration, like the one that we have just done with the Excel. You can pick the operation. You can link, for example, the SharePoint side codes, the email sending. So pretty much everything that we have done with the SSRS reports, we can also now do with the electronic reporting reports. And also, of course, in the report setup, if we have a look to the report setup here, you will see this links to a SharePoint location, which in our case is, well, very much the same also again that we have done with the SSRS, but in this case, it's going to rely on the data that we get from the electronic reporting. And again, here also the email template name, as we will see later on when we have a look into the email output, that links to, well, again, of course, the body that is again that designed in dox42, as well as the email subject, etc., etc. So that's everything similar to what you've previously seen, with just a very, very big difference in the background. It now relies on electronic reporting data. Okay, so we have basically defined the electronic report, so the electronic reporting Excel as the data source. We've done the dox42 configurations. We've also linked that to a specific template in this case. The missing part is, how do we know, for example, in this case, when I printed the report, that instead of using the SSRS, it is now going to use the dox42 electronic report combination. Let's have a look into, for the invoice and the form setup. If we go to the form setup, to the print management, to see which generations we targeted. So if we look into the customer invoice, what you will be able to see in here is that we already linked to our new configuration in this case. We could, of course, also trigger the standard sales invoice Excel from, well, electronic reporting. We could also use the SSRS. If the SSRS is then able to use dox42 in the background, it will, of course, still do so. And at the same time, of course, if we then use the one that we have now linked to dox42 as part of the SSRS, this will trigger it to be then used via the dox42. Okay, that's the combination. So we have the configurations, first of all, in electronic reporting. We have the dox42 configurations that link them to a specific report. And then we have in the dox42 reports linked that configuration to, in this case, the invoice. And lastly, in the print management, we define the report format for it to be using dox42. Okay, and the output, in this case, is something that we can then define via the destination. That is the first thing where it's a little different. So instead of, well, as you're used to with selecting the print management, we are going to rely in this case on the output management that is based on electronic reporting, where you can select which printers you can target. As you see here, for example, in my case, I have only selected the screen. But of course, we could at the same time also, if we have a look into our settings, define which ones are enabled. So if we, for example, want to trigger the archive, which is also something, of course, that we can do, which, well, dox42, generally, if you print by a screen, it will trigger the archive automatically. If you don't enable the screen, but you just use the archive, it would, for example, not show it on screen, but save it to SharePoint or send it via mail, which is something that we did in this case also. But because we selected the screen and the archive at the same time, with, of course, also our configuration again. And maybe just to mention, of course, you can also use multiple at the same time. So if we, let's say, if you also even want to trigger the electronic reporting standards, you could, of course, do so. So that, well, standard as you're used to with electronic reporting, that you can trigger multiple print targets at the same time. Good, that's that. And now, last but not least, let's have a look into, in terms of the output, the email that we generated. The email, of course, again, is going to be the email that, well, we have, in this case, triggered and generated with the PDF that we have generated also, of course, but at the same time also with the email body that we have. Remember, in the report configuration, we selected which report should be the email body. That is the very one that's linking to this Word template in the background, but also relying on the electronic reporting data. Good. So much for that. Now, on the design side, what we have here is, well, first of all, let me show you what data structure, in this case, we created in electronic reporting, which it's the data structure we are going to rely on when it comes to the integration into the dox42 template design. So we have, for example, an example here of the sales invoice. And that, again, of course, is very much up to you. In this case, we opted for an option where you see where we have multiple sheets that then have, for example, also the labels included. And we did, for example, for the company info, just create it into one sheet. But you could have all, in this case, for example, also in one sheet, that you then would be able to just have very, very little Excel data sources in the report. That is 100% up to you, and depending on the design that you want to do later on. In our case, well, as you see, we will have the lateral data sources, for example, for the company information. And that very much links to the data fields and includes also the data. And that for multiple, like, for example, if we have a look into the invoice lines, we will be able to see that we get, first of all, the data field names, but also, of course, also the data. That's the report we generate from electronic reporting. And how do we do that then in dox42? What we will first of all need to set up is if we have a look into our invoice template. In this case, it's for all languages. As you see, it doesn't have a language code at the end. And we will, if we open this directly in Word, you will see, well, first of all, those of you who haven't seen version 5 yet, this is version 5. If we click on Insert Data Field, instead of having a lot of finance and supply chain data sources here, we will in this case rely on just a few, because we will get the data as the Excel. And then in all the Excel data sources that we use here, those will be the ones that are linked to the very Excel that we have already just seen. Now, the testing option is still very much the same, so you can always click on Generate, and we'll still be presented with a transaction ID and just generate locally in this case, depending on the data that you have from that report. And we will be able to look into them side by side, see that all the dox42 logic is of course applied. So we do have the header, the footer as the information that gets inserted. We do have, for example, the date times, the numbers, everything, well, as we have been working with in the past, but in this case, just with a little difference that it's coming from, in this case, the Excel of electronic reporting. Okay, the data, of course, in itself is the magic part, which is happening in the data map. And those of you who have worked with the Excel data source, in this case, in the past, there will be nothing new here. But for those who haven't, that's the way to go now for the electronic reporting integration with, in this case, well, many Excel data sources. Or as I said, if you want to have all the data in one sheet and just like have them in one list, then you could, of course, also opt for fewer ones. If you want to work with XML from electronic reporting, you could do so too. And then instead of the Excel data source, it would be the XML JSON data source from our end. But what we do here, very much, if we have a look, for example, into the electronic reporting data, the data sources are still the same. So we still have the report data source and we still have the entity data source. The big difference now is that in the report data source, you will be presented first with the data provider option, but secondly, also with the electronic reporting configuration. So the two reports that we had in the dox42 parameters, you can select here with still, as you see, the standard options here. Also with the new version, the finance and supply chain data source got a little update. And we will be able, depending on the electronic report setups that we have, to see them here as well, like we do. And the fields that we retrieve in this case is the file name, the partition, the rec ID, most importantly, the base64 file, because the base64 file is the one that we rely on, which is which is pretty much the Excel that we then get through the call to dox42. And that's the data that we will be working with. And now if we have a look into, for example, here, the Excel data source, what we are doing here is, well, we are loading, having the name, well, whatever you want to define it for. You can then, in this case, we don't have a file because we load it directly from a data field, which in our case would be the base64 data that we rely on. We have the Excel as a format. We initialize, we don't in this case, because initialize is writing into Excel. But what we do is we do the data source output, which is in our case very much data that we read from a specific area that you can, if you click on those three dots, select the range. Yeah, standard as we have been working with the Excel data source in the past. Yeah, and that is the very data we then get, like we do here. And that's just one example of information that we retrieve. As you've seen, we do that per sheet in this case, and it's up to you how many sheets, of course, you do. So if you want to have one, we have a lot of data, that is perfectly fine to be used this way. Okay, so that's the Excel. That's the report data that we get, the transaction ID, the crypto data source, the connection is still the same as you are very much used to from the past, only with the difference that now the data is coming from electronic reporting. Okay, we have seen what we have to do in the finance and supply chain in the front end. We have also seen what we have to do in the add-in. And at the end of the day, that just adds another layer of huge potential, because of course, switching from needing to further enhance the data provider to being able to do that more on electronic reporting decides, from my perspective, adds a whole new level of options with the dox42 integration. And that is, well, the main reason why we did that, and we have done a lot and invested a lot on this from the past. And I hope it's going to be great fun for you to work with this. We can't wait to see what options it brings to the whole environment and to the whole community. And yeah, that being said, very much looking forward to seeing all of you soon at one of the conferences or any other event. And see you soon. Bye.